All right. Hello there, Facebook world. Give you guys just a minute. Sorry I'm a little late. Uh, just getting ready to tackle another subject on here. I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk about sensory issues with autism spectrum disorders. And this is going to be a brief video, but I'm going to kind of describe some of the difficulties, what it may look like, that kind of thing. So the first thing to note with this is when you're dealing with an autism spectrum disorder, there are a couple of different aspects of it. One of them is the social and kind of communication aspect of the disorder, and I'll talk about that in a future video. The other one is the sensory aspect of it. So when you're talking sensory, you're talking your senses, taste, smell, touch, sight, and sound. And what happens is we live in a world that bombards people all the time with different sights, sounds, textures, different clothing textures, different lights, that kind of thing. So you've got that, and then typically people try and process it and don't even think about it. Their brains try and process all these things that are bombarding us all the time. And so constantly bombarded, we're all constantly bombarded by this. With autism spectrum disorders, what happens is you get easily overwhelmed by all the different things that you can be bombarded with. For example, some people with an autism spectrum disorder might have trouble with certain types of lighting in a room. Some of them have trouble with different textures of clothing or even different fits of clothing. It's not unheard of to have people with autism spectrum disorders that wear kind of unconventional styles of clothing because they either don't like the texture of conventional styles or the fit of it. It doesn't feel good to them for some reason, and that's because of the sensory aspect of it. So that's kind of that in a nutshell. I got asked this all the time in presenting, how can you like music and how can you be in band when I have a particular sensitivity to my hearing and to getting overwhelmed. And the thing I would kind of respond with is that music is very organized. Typically, I don't get overwhelmed by stuff like that. I remember a specific time when I did get overwhelmed, and that was a time when I was playing vibraphone, and that's a xylophone that's metallic. So the sound, it has a very metallic sound, and that sound just that day was very kind of got under my skin, and I had to leave the room for a few minutes to be able to kind of calm down and be able to tackle that again. But the reason I wanted to share this is it can look a little bit strange to somebody who doesn't know much about the autism spectrum to see someone struggle with this. It might look a little peculiar because if somebody goes into a meltdown because they're overwhelmed by the texture of the clothing they're wearing, or they can't be touched, they're having a hard time being touched in a room full of people or something like that, it might be a little bit weird for them to go into a meltdown in the middle of a situation like that. The big thing to know with this is that autism spectrum disorders lead people to be more sensitive with their senses, and they can be easily overwhelmed, especially in a world where, you know, we've got screens right in front of us that bombard us with sight all the time. We advertisements, you know, lighting, all kinds of things that can be easily overwhelming to the senses. And so it's easy for them to go into a meltdown. And I'll talk about meltdowns in a future video as well, and what you can do to help handle that. But one thing to note is usually people with an ASD will need to get out of a situation where they are where they're overwhelmed. A lot of times that involves leaving a room where it's overly crowded. It might involve some kind of noise canceling headphones. I've used those before. When I was first diagnosed with Asperger's, when I was in elementary school, there were kind of sensory toys. There's a kind of a stress ball kind of thing for touch. Different things like that that could kind of counteract the stimulation from the overstimulation from the senses. The other thing to keep in mind is that that it really isn't that weird if you think about what a sensory overload is. It's just that we're more sensitive to these kind of things, and so it can be easily overwhelming. But it's pretty easy to know that we're bombarded, whether you have an ASD or not, with all kinds of sensory things. Our world is a very sensory, kind of unfriendly place. But the other thing is there are some businesses like movie theaters, that kind of thing, that do sensory-friendly nights for kids especially. And a lot of times autism spectrum disorders or people with sensory processing disorders, that'll be a great opportunity for them to be able to enjoy, say, a movie in a situation that's a little less sensory overwhelming. The volume might be turned down on the movie a little bit. The lighting might be just a little bit different, so it's not quite as overly stimulating, and it doesn't trigger a meltdown. So I wanted to share that. I also wanted to share that I do feel that with both some obstacle removal, my family and I would talk about this all the time on the road when we were presenting about autism spectrum disorders, either removing the obstacles or making them a little bit easier to navigate. It can help draw out the potential with people with autism. And that's kind of my goal here, is to dispel kind of fear of people with autism spectrum disorders, what they're facing, kind of the battles that are involved with that, and drawing out the potential that's there. I'll keep saying this. I said this in the last video. One of the biggest, most basic tenets of my personal faith in God is that we are His children, and that we have unlimited potential, and that potential can, if we treat each other in a way where we can be more empathetic and draw out that potential, there's so much good that can come into the world. And that's honestly one of the biggest things that our world needs right now. Essentially the love of Christ. So that's kind of it in a nutshell with the sensory aspect of it. I'll go into more depth when I talk about meltdowns another time. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm probably going to throw the last couple of videos up on YouTube and get a YouTube channel going and get this going a little more frequently. I was out on vacation last week, and so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I've been a presenter for autism spectrum disorders. I've been around the block as far as that goes. And if I don't know the answer to something, I definitely know where to point you in the direction where you can find your answer. So thank you so much. Hope you all have a great day.